Now, given everything we've just covered, Europe is being forced to rethink whether it can count on the United States for its defense. The United States has a massive presence on the European continent with bases. You see them there in Germany, Italy, Belgium, Poland, and multiple other countries. Most European countries spend much less on their militaries than the U.S. in percentage terms. You see it there. Europe is particularly dependent on the U.S. for support equipment like satellites and transport vehicles, not to mention the all-important nuclear umbrella. Matthew Savill is the director of the Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, and he joins us now. Grateful to have you on the program. Head spinning it is indeed. And firstly, I want to know, do you agree that it is time for Europe to work towards that military autonomy? And if you agree with that, what are the obstacles today that they'll face in trying to do that?
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be on. I mean, it's long past time for Europe to up its game on its defence capabilities. Whether or not that is autonomy is a different matter. I think the biggest impediment is actually turning their undoubted financial strength into actual material gains. Ukraine has prompted some soul searching and investment. And in fact, we are 10 years on from the NATO summit in Wales, which set the 2% target that most European countries are now meeting. But the reality is that investment has been sluggish and they've probably not been taking this seriously enough.
And when we talk about the investments being sluggish, though, what in material terms does that mean? What do they need to be investing in now? So even if it's not full autonomy, that it gets much closer to that?
Well, what we're facing at the moment is a consequence of essentially very small and incremental growth. So it's, there was the pledge increases before the first Trump administration, but then that accelerated when he came in. But we are still talking about a case where Europe's defense spending in total is about $450 billion. And that is basically half what the US spends, although it's considerably more than Russia. Where we are looking at is a combination of depth, mass, ammunition stockpiles, and also certain sophisticated areas where the Europeans rely very heavily on the US.
Now, if a future Trump administration significantly reduces, or, it is even possible that they might consider ending military assistance to Ukraine, how would that impact Europe's security? It's a completely different discussion as to whether or not Europe could pick up the slack for Ukraine, but how would it actually impact Europe's security?
I mean, this is the question that depends very heavily on what the scenario looks like in Ukraine. But let's, for the sake of assumption, say that there's a relatively, there's a ceasefire relatively soon. What you'd be looking at is Russian rearmament and recapitalization, largely of their ground forces, which have suffered the bulk of the casualties. I think it's worth noting that the Russian threat spreads across, the army's heavily committed to Ukraine. Their air force is heavily committed, but can switch. There's obviously a considerable maritime threat, and particularly Russian submarines and Russian undersea vessels, as well as the sabotage, the intelligence threat. The big problem that the Europeans have is that they need to increase their artillery shell production. They have a target of 2 million shells by the end of this year, and they need to increase their stocks of precision weapons. The area where they rely very heavily on the US is US air power, and particularly the ability to destroy enemy air defenses and radar sites. And so Europe needs to effectively build up sophisticated precision strike there, and actually its own long-range strike. There is a European program for a sort of long-range ground-launched cruise missile, but that's in its very early stages.
I don't have a lot of time left, but I have to ask you this. Given all of this will cost money, do you believe that European leaders need to be very straight with their populations at this point in time and tell European citizens this will cost us?
I mean, yes, and they are already giving out those messages, but the question is how much is enough? I think the percentage question at that point becomes a bit redundant because GDP is a moving target. What they really need to do is work out what is necessary to increase war stocks and buy some of those sophisticated capabilities. There are some signs of progress. In a couple of years, we'll have about 400 F-35s being operated by European air forces, but they're going to need to spend more on recruitment and training to make sure that particularly ground forces are at higher levels of readiness.
Yeah, I note they are American fighter jets, not the European models, which they apparently should have been working on as well. Matthew Savill, we have to leave it there, but really appreciate the conversation.